The separation agreement sat unsigned on the kitchen island for 11 days, before Claudia Renwick finally picked up a pen. She'd read it the first morning it arrived, standing at the counter with her coat still on, wet from November rain she'd walked through without an umbrella. She read every clause, every paragraph. Then she set it down and started the coffee maker like it was any other Tuesday. Archer had expected tears, or anger. He'd come downstairs that first evening to find her making dinner, actually cooking, something she hadn't done in months, and the look on his face when she handed him a bowl of soup without a word was almost worth everything that had followed. "Did you even read it?" he asked. "I read it," she said. She hadn't signed it yet because she was reading the fine print a second time. Not out of hope. Out of habit. Claudia had always been the one who read the fine print. She had met Archer Pelham 11 years ago at a structural engineering conference in Calgary. He was charming then in the way that men are charming when they still have something to prove, eager to listen, quick to laugh, genuinely curious about her work. She'd designed load-bearing systems for 3 municipal buildings by the time she was 32. He'd been trying to get a small development company off the ground. They fell in love fast and built slowly, which should have been a sign. She signed the papers on the 11th day, not because she'd decided to let go. She'd let go somewhere in the middle of year 8, when she realized she was still doing the technical drawings for his firm's proposals at 2 in the morning while Archer slept upstairs. But because she was ready to stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. The morning she left the signed documents on his desk. Archer was getting dressed for a morning meeting. He glanced at the papers and then looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him in years, something close to surprise. "I thought you'd fight for this," he said. Claudia picked up her bag. "Fight for what, Archer?" He didn't answer. She walked out the front door. What Archer had never properly understood was that Claudia hadn't chosen to stay in the background. She had simply been most useful there for a long time, and she had let that usefulness become a habit she forgot to question. She was not the kind of woman who announced what she was worth. She was the kind who built things. And she had built a great many things under her husband's name. The firm, Pelham Development Group, had made its first serious money on a mixed-use project in Hamilton that was now considered a modest landmark in the city's revitalization. Claudia had designed the structural system. Not just consulted, designed. She'd solved an engineering problem with the existing foundation that 2 other firms had called unfixable, and her solution was the reason the project came in on budget and stayed standing. Archer had presented it at a municipal planning meeting. She'd sat 2 rows back. That was 8 years ago. She didn't dwell on this, she never had. But she hadn't forgotten it either. Delia Farrow had appeared in Archer's professional circle about 8 months before the separation. She was a business development consultant, polished, connected, the kind of woman who moved through a networking event like she'd organized it herself. She knew exactly which names to drop and in which order. She made Archer feel Claudia suspected, like the most important person in any room, which was something Claudia had genuinely tried and slowly stopped trying to do. "Does your wife come to these industry events?" Delia had asked him at a developer's dinner in the spring. "She's more of a behind-the-scenes person," Archer said. "Technical work. She's not really built for this side of things." Delia had tilted her head sympathetically. "That must make it lonely." It was the first time someone had told Archer that what he'd been feeling was loneliness, rather than impatience, and the reframing was enough. Within 3 months, Claudia had found a text on his phone she wasn't supposed to see. 2 months after that, the separation agreement appeared on the kitchen island. She signed it. She moved into a small apartment in the East End of Toronto, a place with large windows and floors she didn't have to share. She slept better than she had in years. Meanwhile, she had a competition to finish. Claudia had submitted a preliminary application 18 months earlier, quietly, without telling Archer, for a national design competition organized by the Canadian Urban Infrastructure Initiative. The brief called for a mixed-use transit hub in downtown Ottawa, a project that would be built, not just proposed, with federal funding already secured. The competition was open to individual architects and engineers as well as firms. She had entered under her own name, not Pelham Development, her name. She had started the design during the last hard year of her marriage, in the hours between when Archer fell asleep and when she made herself stop. The drawings were good. She knew they were good in the way she always knew when something was structurally sound. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of steady certainty that didn't require anyone else to confirm it. She refined the submission in her new apartment, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, cup of tea beside her laptop, the city murmuring outside. The results were announced on a Thursday afternoon in March. Claudia was on her lunch break, sitting in a park near her new office, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The woman on the other end identified herself as the communications director for the CUI. She spoke for about 45 seconds. Claudia thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a long time watching pigeons argue over a crust of bread near the fountain. Then she went back to work. The announcement went public the following Monday morning. By Tuesday, the design renderings were running in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and on the homepage of Architecture Canada. By Wednesday, the CBC had run a feature on her. By Thursday, a poster-sized reproduction of the winning design was mounted in the window of a planning and architecture firm on King Street West. Claudia walked past it on her way to the office and kept walking. Archer Pelham found out the way he found out most things that didn't relate directly to him, through someone else in passing. He was in a breakfast meeting at a hotel near Yonge and Bloor, going over numbers with a potential investor. His phone was face down on the table the way it always was when he wanted to appear focused. His assistant Olivia sent a text anyway. "Have you seen the architecture news today? Your ex-wife?" He glanced at it, turned the phone back over and continued the conversation. But something had shifted in his attention. When the meeting ended 20 minutes later, he stayed in his chair, scrolling. The first article was in Architecture Canada. National competition winner, Claudia Renwick's Ottawa Hub reimagines transit as community infrastructure. He read the headline 3 times. Then he did what people do when something doesn't make sense to them yet. He searched her name, and the results were substantial. Not just the competition win. Feature profiles in 3 major publications. A CBC interview in which she spoke quietly about structural design philosophy and the specific engineering solutions built into the Ottawa project. A profile in Canadian Architect magazine, with a photo of her standing at a window of her East End apartment, looking out at the street below with an expression he couldn't quite read. She looked like herself, completely, uncomplicatedly herself. That was the thing that unsettled him most. He'd spent the last year carrying a version of Claudia in his mind that had calcified somewhere around year 7 of the marriage. Quiet, capable in a narrow technical way, comfortable with invisibility. He had mistaken her contentment for limitation. He had looked at her refusal to self-promote and read it as an inability to compete. He closed all the tabs and drove to the office. By noon, 3 separate colleagues had sent him links. By end of day, Olivia knocked on his office door and said, with eyes she was not entirely managing to keep professional, "The Ottawa Hub, it's being described as the most significant public infrastructure design in Canada in a decade. It's everywhere." "I know," he said. "It's Claudia." "I know, Olivia." She left. He sat at his desk for a long time with his hands flat on the surface, not doing anything. The story of how Claudia had arrived at the competition entry came out gradually, through the interviews she gave over the following weeks. Interviews Archer read compulsively and without telling anyone. She'd been approached by the CUII 18 months ago, she explained, when a colleague had forwarded her work from the Hamilton project. She had almost declined. She was in the middle of a personal transition, she said, choosing her words carefully, but she'd decided that declining had become too reflexive a habit. "I'd spent a lot of years making myself smaller in professional spaces," she told Architecture Canada, "not because anyone forced me to, but because I'd gotten used to it. The competition felt like a chance to take up the space I'd actually earned." Archer read that and set his phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. He was also noticing, by this point, that Delia was becoming less available. It had started small. A dinner rescheduled, a call that went to voicemail and was returned 2 days later. He told himself she was busy. She had clients. She had a whole network he was still being slowly admitted into, and he didn't want to appear demanding. He was still operating on the assumption that he had something to offer her. That his trajectory, as she'd once put it approvingly, was moving upward. Then came the call from the CBRE Capital Partners Group. Archer had been in conversation with them for 6 months. A commercial property portfolio refinancing deal, the kind that would genuinely change the scale of his firm. They'd been warm, engaged, responsive. Then the responses slowed. Then, in the span of 3 weeks, 2 principals quietly withdrew. He reached the one remaining contact, a man named Hector, who had always been direct with him, during a late afternoon in April. Hector was direct this time too. "Look, Archer, you're a capable operator. But there's been some conversation around your firm's history, specifically around the technical wins over the past decade. People are doing more research than they used to. And the current news cycle around your ex-wife has some people looking at the Hamilton project again." Archer's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of looking?" "The kind where they're asking who actually designed the structural solution. Former colleagues, contractors." "People talk, Archer. And when someone is in every major publication in the country right now, and there's a direct historical connection to your firm's best-known work, people start doing math. The call ended. Archer sat in his car in the underground parking garage for 20 minutes without turning on the ignition. He called 2 former employees that week. He'd always known they liked Claudia better than they liked him, but he'd told himself that was beside the point. Now the point had moved. The first, an engineer named Bruno, who'd left the firm 4 years ago, picked up on the second ring. The Hamilton project, Archer said without preamble. What about it? Bruno said. Who solved the foundation problem? There was a pause that was answer enough on its own. Archer, you know who solved it. I need to hear you say it. Claudia, Bruno said. She was in the office until 1 in the morning for 3 weeks straight. She found the load transfer solution. She drew it. I was there. So were 4 other people on that team. A pause. I don't know what you're hoping I'll tell you, but I can't tell you something different from what happened. Archer thanked him and ended the call. He sat in the house that evening, the house he and Claudia had shared, which now echoed in ways it hadn't when she was in it, and tried to construct a version of events in which he hadn't known what he'd been doing. It was harder than he expected. The truth was that he had known on some level for years. He had simply chosen not to name it. Naming it would have required looking at what she contributed with the same seriousness he applied to everything else. It would have required changing the internal accounting he'd been running since year 3 of the marriage, the one in which he was the builder and she was the support structure. He had preferred his version. It was more comfortable, and it allowed him to be more important than he actually was. Delia ended things on a Tuesday evening. She called rather than meeting in person, which Archer later recognized as efficiency rather than cowardice. She had never been interested in unnecessary complexity. I've been thinking about where I want to put my energy over the next few years, she said. She spoke carefully, the way she did when she'd prepared for a conversation. I need to be aligned with people whose momentum is clearly forward. You've had some headwinds lately. I think it's better to acknowledge that, honestly. You're leaving, he said. I think this is the right time. After she hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He thought about all the things he'd told himself over the past year. That leaving Claudia was the honest thing, the brave thing. That he was finally choosing what he actually wanted. He'd said those words out loud, he'd believed them. Now he was sitting alone in the kitchen of the house, where Claudia used to work late into the evening, and the logic didn't hold. The professional distance that followed was quieter than he expected and more complete. In the development circles where he'd spent 15 years building a name, the recalibration was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations that used to stretch now ended at natural stopping points. A conference he attended every spring felt different. Not hostile, just less engaged. He stood at a side table during the cocktail hour and overheard, without meaning to, 2 colleagues he'd known for a decade talking near the windows. The Ottawa hub is tracking for some kind of design award. The shortlist is already circulating. I know, I saw her on the CBC last week, she's extraordinary. Didn't she used to be with Pelham, the development guy? A brief pause. Yeah. Just that one syllable, flat and small, containing everything. He left the conference before dinner and drove through downtown without a destination, taking roads he didn't usually take, eventually finding himself in the neighborhood near the waterfront, where he and Claudia had lived when they were first starting out. Small apartment, 1 car between them, evenings at the kitchen table where she would spread out drawings and walk him through problems in structural physics with the patience of someone who found teaching genuinely enjoyable. He had found that patience tedious once it became familiar. He parked and walked for a while. He passed the print shop where she used to print her larger drawings on Saturday mornings. The library she went to every other Thursday. The coffee shop where she'd once explained, on a napkin, the difference between live load and dead load and how you designed for both. A conversation he had recalled, almost word for word, in a pitch to investors 2 years later without crediting her. He had stopped seeing her. He could locate the period when it happened but not the exact moment. It had been gradual, the way real things often are. The gratitude had turned into expectation. The expectation had turned into something uglier, a quiet contempt for the constancy he'd come to rely on, as though dependability were the same thing as limitation. He tried to reach her once. He sent a message through a mutual colleague, not a call, because he understood she would not pick up, and not an email because he couldn't find the right language. Just a brief note asking if she'd be willing to have a conversation. Her response came back through the same colleague 2 days later. Claudia says she genuinely wishes you well. She's in a good place and she's focused on what's in front of her. She doesn't think a conversation would add anything for either of you at this point. He read it standing in the lobby of his building, rain on the windows behind him. It was not cold, it was not angry. There was no edge in it, no satisfaction at his circumstances. Not even the faint heat of someone who still cared enough to want him to know he'd hurt them. Just a quiet, complete closing of a door. He had expected resentment. Resentment would have meant he still occupied territory in her life. This was something else entirely. The absence of drama because he no longer warranted it. He thought, more than once, about the morning he'd told her the decision was made. He'd been getting dressed. She'd been standing at the bedroom doorway and he'd said, because he'd wanted it to land, had wanted her to feel the verdict clearly. You've always been more comfortable being invisible. I need someone who actually shows up. He had said it to wound her. He had wanted her to argue. She hadn't. She'd looked at him for a moment, steady and without expression, and then walked down the hallway. And that was the last private conversation they'd had. Now her name was in every publication he'd ever wanted to be featured in. The Governor General's Award in Architecture was announced in September, the highest recognition in the field in Canada. Claudia Renwick for the Ottawa Transit Hub, designed under her own name with her own credentials. For a project already under construction and already being described as a generational contribution to how the country thinks about public space. Archer read about it the same way he'd read everything connected to her this past year, through his phone, between meetings, in the spaces he used to fill with other things. He set the phone down and looked out the window at the city for a long time. That evening, he drove home by a longer route than necessary. On King Street West, the architecture firm with the poster in its window had updated the display. It was a photograph from the award ceremony. Claudia in a dark green dress, mid-law, holding the award like it was slightly lighter than she'd expected. He looked at it through his windshield, stopped at a red light. The light changed, he drove on. The foundation announcement came 6 weeks later, a small item in a professional newsletter he almost didn't open. The Renwick Foundation for Women in Engineering and Design, a new grant program offering funding, mentorship, and industry placement for women in the early stages of structural engineering and architecture careers. Primary donor, Claudia Renwick. Founding partner, the Canadian Urban Infrastructure Initiative. 12 universities had already signed on. First grants would be awarded in the spring. The launch event was held at the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, on a cold Wednesday evening in November. Archer told himself he was there because the initiative overlapped with municipal development policy, relevant to a new project his firm was tracking. He told himself it was professional due diligence. He stood at the back of the room, near the side wall, where the crowd was thick enough that he could disappear into it. Claudia took the stage to applause that started before she reached the microphone. She was wearing something simple and dark. She looked the way the press photographs hadn't quite captured, not because she was more polished in person, but because there was something in her posture that photographs couldn't hold. She moved like someone who had stopped bracing for a blow that was no longer coming. She spoke without notes. Someone told me not so long ago that I was more comfortable being invisible. She paused. The room was completely still. And the strange thing is, I let that land. Not because it was true, but because I'd spent enough years arranging myself around other people's comfort that I'd started to confuse their limitations for my own. She looked out at the room. I built a lot of things that carried other people's names. And I could spend time being angry about that. Some days, honestly, I was. But what I kept coming back to was this. The work was still mine. My ability to solve a problem didn't disappear because someone else stood at the podium and announced it. And eventually, the work found its way back to where it belonged. The applause started quietly and built. This foundation exists because I know there are women in this room, and in rooms I will never be in, who are building things right now under someone else's name, who are doing the technical work and watching someone else do the talking, who have been told in every possible direct and indirect way that the quiet kind of contribution doesn't count. She let the silence hold for a moment. It counts. It has always counted. And the people who couldn't see it, that was always their limitation, not yours. The room broke open with applause. Archer stood at the back with his hands still and watched her. He felt the sting in his eyes before he understood it was coming. Not because he wanted her back. That desire had been replaced by something heavier and less comfortable. Something that had no room in it for what he wanted. What moved through him was older and harder to name. The particular grief of understanding the full shape of something after it was already past. Of standing at the edge of what you'd helped unmake, and finally grasping its actual size. He didn't wait for the evening to end. He found a side exit and walked out into the November cold, buttoning his coat against the wind coming off the lake. He stopped once on the sidewalk. Across the street, on the glass face of an office building, someone had mounted a large format reproduction of the Ottawa Hub rendering, foundation promotional material. The structure rose from a wide-open plaza, clean angles and sheltered gathering space, with a line of text along the bottom in simple type, designed by Claudia Renwick, built for everyone. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned up his collar and kept walking forward. There was nothing else to do. There was no version of this he could revise or reclaim. He had been given years with a woman who built things quietly and well, and asked for almost nothing except to be seen. He had not seen her. He had looked at everything she offered and called it ordinary, and now he was standing alone on a sidewalk in November, looking at her name on a building while the city moved past him, like he was a post in the middle of a river. He walked to his car, he drove home. He made himself something to eat and didn't taste it. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment with large windows and floors she didn't have to share, Claudia Renwick was reading over grant applications, a cup of tea beside her laptop, the city glowing below in the cold, clear dark. She was not thinking about Archer. She had built too many things since then to spend much time looking back at what she'd left behind. If Claudia's story stays with you, let it remind you of something worth holding on to. The work you do in silence is still work. The talent that goes unnoticed is still talent. And no one, not a partner who looked right through you, not the years that passed before the world caught up, can take credit for what you actually built. Have you ever felt like your contributions were invisible until it was too late? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and join us at Brave FSOL's Stories TV. Because the people others overlook today are so often the ones the world can't stop talking about tomorrow.